Close-Up is brought to you by the Kia Sorento R, redefining the power of Kia.
Ecstasy is less toxic than alcohol, so why is booze still the acceptable face of drugs in our society? It's this passionate, outspoken belief that got Professor David Nutt sacked from his job as the British government's top advisor on drugs and alcohol. He may have been sacked, but he hasn't stopped warning politicians they need to pay attention to the science. And not just British politicians. He has harsh words for ours as Parliament gears up for its final reading of the Alcohol Reform Bill this week. Jill Higgins went to Imperial College in London, where Professor Nutt now works, and continues to call for change.
In homes across the UK, viewers recently switched on to a groundbreaking series, watching people get a kick out of ecstasy.
Sorry, I just feel really happy.
In charge of this unprecedented trial, and with us here tonight, Professor of Psychiatry, David Nutt.
He's taken pill popping to prime time.
We've got an ex-MP, we've got a vicar, we've got the editor of New Scientist.
Taboo for some,
We've colour-coded here parts of the brain.
essential teaching tool for others.
I'm going to show them what a brain is, which bits do what, and how ecstasy affects those parts.
Do you enjoy being controversial?
No, I don't enjoy being controversial, because I don't think I should be controversial. I think what I'm saying is makes perfect sense. You know, so what I must do is I must make people think.
And now is the time to think about alcohol.
We've got this tidal wave of alcohol-related damage. If alcohol was discovered today, it would be made illegal.
And that view that club drugs are safer than booze got this chief government advisor sensationally sacked.
People don't want to believe alcohol's a drug, but it is a drug. Of course it's a drug. It's a very powerful drug. It's one of the most addictive drugs we know.
He says popping a few E's is safer than heavy drinking.
Alcohol is much, much more damaging to society. In the UK, alcohol kills 8,000 people a year. Ecstasy kills 18.
Isn't that just a numbers game? Fewer people are on
Yeah,
ecstasy.
fewer people. That's true. And of course, that's a significant aspect of it. But even if you just go to the very bare bones, you know, just take one ecstasy tablet, one bottle of beer or wine. Alcohol is more toxic.
That's the science, and then there's society.
People don't realise how much they're drinking, and they are slowly killing themselves through the liver damage, the heart damage, etc.
His views on drugs are radical, always have been. But if recent surveys are right, most Kiwis agree with his view on alcohol, that something has to change for excessive drinking to stop.
When we liberalised the drinking laws so that shops could sell alcohol instead of just pubs. And then the second factor is we've made it cheaper. So those two factors almost solely determine this massive increase in health damage. So we just reverse them. You just make it more expensive, and we're going to do that now. We're going to have minimum pricing, thankfully. And you also restrict availability.
But despite being pushed by Labour and the Maori Party, National had this to say on minimum pricing in New Zealand.
It's not going to be part of this bill because the New Zealand research has shown it is unlikely to make a scrap of difference to young binge drinkers.
Well, that was a real mistake. Minimum pricing almost certainly would reduce alcohol intake in the people who are most vulnerable. The great thing about minimum pricing is it actually doesn't particularly affect the moderate drinker. It mostly affects the people who drink very heavily. So there should be no argument. Minimum pricing, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, to say it doesn't work is actually to completely mislead the public.
So if the science is there, why don't politicians go for it?
And I think a lot of politicians are in the pockets of the drinks industry. It's a hugely powerful industry.
So National's plan for self-regulation?
Getting the alcohol industry to regulate itself is like telling an alcoholic to stop drinking. I mean, it's just fatuous words. The alcohol industry has absolutely no interest in anything other than increasing its sales.
And as for failing to lower the drinking age...
You've made a big mistake in New Zealand. We now use New Zealand as an example of how, when you reduce the drinking age, you get more damage and more road traffic accidents.
In the UK, his latest bid is to get the government to rethink cannabis to help with the alcohol problem.
I've argued recently that we should reconsider the way in which the Dutch have dealt with the cannabis problem by having cafes. Cafes were designed largely so that young people could experience cannabis without going to dealers. A lot of people who go and get drunk would actually quite like to be stoned instead. But because one's illegal, they don't do it. And I've argued that you could actually reduce the damage from alcohol by up to about 25%, if we had a more liberal, sensible policy on cannabis. And that would also have huge impacts for policing, because there's much less violence when people use cannabis.
The problems are similar across the Western world. How each country deals with them, that will be the difference.
It's estimated that perhaps within 10 years, alcoholic liver disease will kill more men in this country than heart disease. It's a huge and growing problem. We've got to do something about it.
Joining me now, about to head back into the debating chamber, is Chester Burrows, Associate Justice Minister and head of the Select Committee that examined the alcohol bill. Look, thanks for joining us tonight, Minister. Are our politicians in the pockets of the liquor industry?
No, they're not, man. It's easy enough to check on that. If you look back at the records we now keep on who donates what to political parties.
What he seems to be saying, though, isn't it, that the lack of moves by a lot of governments, or the watering down of some of the things in this bill, is playing into the hands of the liquor industry. We're ignoring the facts.
Well, what he hasn't conceded is that for the first time in about 80 years, this government has taken the opportunity to constrain very severely the sale and supply of alcohol from where it's been, and by the time it passes through the House, it will have the support of all parties across the House.
How's it severe?
Well, it's doing a lot of things that the current law doesn't do. For instance, it allows local people to have more say on the number of licensing outlets within their communities, where they will be placed, what hours they will operate from. No, it's not delayed for a year. It's part of this bill, and quite frankly, if the Labor opposition had decided to back it earlier and not look back at history, actually we could have been through and it could have been in by now.
One of the contentious issues, of course, that was mentioned there by Professor Nutt is minimum pricing. Now, when Simon Power when the bill was first coming in, people were expecting something to happen on minimum pricing. Why has that been ignored?
Well, minimum pricing is something that has worked in some countries that aren't really comparative to New Zealand. For instance, in some Scandinavian countries they have minimum pricing, in some states in Canada they have minimum pricing, but what do you know, the state government owns all the outlets, so it's not a comparable situation to New Zealand.
Canada,
the other
UK,
thing we've
Scotland?
Well, they've decided to put it into Scotland, and that's been challenged at the moment, but it doesn't exist in the UK at the moment, in other parts of the UK. If we look at how, for instance, spirits were heavily, or RTDs were heavily taxed in Australia by way of raising a minimum price, what happened was they did what we used to do in our day, Mark, was go out and buy a bottle of Plonk, buy some splits, mix their own, drink stronger drinks and drink more pure alcohol, which just exacerbated the problem.
But RTD...
It's not an easy fix.
No, it's not an easy fix. And yes, you are doing something. The question is it enough? Now, the RTDs is a perfect example. Simon Power, when he first brought it in, said they're going to try and restrict them to 5%. Judith Collins said 6%. Yep. That was then abandoned, and it's up to the industry to self-regulate.
Well, what we've got in the cupboard of this bill, hidden away, is the regulation-making power to be able to do that. But what those who criticise us for not doing much with RTDs at the moment forget is that everywhere else where they've done that sort of thing, the liquor industry has responded by releasing a new product. For instance, cider isn't a big drink here in New Zealand, but in the UK it's huge, and it's all sorts of flavours. In fact, it's all the flavours that RTDs are, and a lot of the alcohol content is higher than where our RTDs are now.
So how can you trust the liquor industry? If you want to squeeze the sausage there, it'll come out somewhere. Well, what we have, as I said before, it's smile but carry a big stick. So we've already got that regulating power within the bill to be able to deal with them. But actually, we have had some good discussions with the liquor industry and those that are marketing RTD. For instance, we've talked about their voluntary removal of milk-based RTDs from the product lines. We've also had discussions around the removal of alcohol and energy drinks, limiting the size of drink containers to either 1.5 or 2 standard drinks, and limiting alcohol. But I go back to the point that within the bill we have the regulating power to be able to enforce how we allow those RTDs to be marketed in this country. Why not do it straight away, though? Why hide it? As you said, it's hidden in the legislation. You've got that stick you can use. Professor Nutt saying, look, you know, the industry is going to try and lobby around things. You can't trust them to self-regulate. Just get in there and do it.
Well, the fact is everyone's lobbying us, and so I've been lobbied by both sides of this debate very, very heavily on a heck of a lot of occasions. So why not come straight out and do it now? The fact is that it is easier and more productive to be able to start off doing it by negotiation. Now, if you're going to say, well, you can't trust them, I accept the point that you've made, except that, as I said before, if we squeeze the sausage hard on RTDs now, it will burst out in marketing cider drinks here, or fruit-flavoured wines, all those sorts of things that are very, very popular alcohol drinks of choice in other countries where they have done this with RTDs. At least we know what RTDs are and what they do. And I'll give you one more, and that is this. Do you want your young daughter out there drinking an RTD that's ready mixed from a narrow-neck bottle, or do you want her out there drinking from a wide-throated glass that's been poured by a boyfriend or the guy behind the bar trying to do other things, Mark?
Well, if the younger prefer they weren't drinking, to be frank with you, Chester Burrows. Look, just briefly before you go, Professor Nutt's theory that some drugs, club drugs, whatever you choose to call them, are safer than alcohol, and governments need to look at that. Are you in favour of at least examining that issue?
Well, he also said horse riding was more dangerous than ecstasy as well. The fact is that I don't think we need another alcohol. The fact is that we do have alcohol, and it's existed within our civilisation for thousands of years. And it's hard enough dealing with what we know about alcohol rather than allowing some other substance, mind-altering substance, to be introduced.
Chester Burrows, appreciate your time tonight.
All the best.